The air inside the grand hall felt heavy, like it was full of secrets and waiting breaths. It was a very big room, the kind where people whisper, even when they don't have to. The walls were painted gold and red, and bright lights shone down from the ceiling like artificial suns. This was the final round of the city's most famous music competition. People called it the Golden Key, and winning it meant you were set for life. You could go to any music school you wanted. You could become a star. Backstage, behind the thick velvet curtain. The air smelled like dust and old wood, and it was very hot. 10-year-old Alara stood in the shadows, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked at her hands. They were small, pale, and shaking just a little bit. She wiped them on her dress, trying to dry the sweat. But it didn't help much. Alara looked around at the other children waiting to go on stage. They all looked so different from her. To her left, a tall boy stood perfectly still, wearing a black suit that looked like it cost more than her father's car. He was polishing his violin with a soft cloth, his face looking calm and bored. On her right, 2 girls were laughing quietly. They wore shiny dresses made of silk that sparkled under the backstage lamps. Their hair was done up in fancy styles, held in place with pins that probably had diamonds on them. Alara looked down at her own dress. It was a simple blue dress, the kind you could buy at a big store in the mall. It was clean, and her mother had ironed it until it was crisp, but it didn't shine. It didn't sparkle. The sleeves were just a little bit too short, showing her wrists. She felt very small and very plain. She felt like a weed growing in a garden, where all the other flowers were made of glass and gold. Number 42, a voice crackled over the speaker. It was a deep, loud voice that made Alara jump. Alara Vance, you are up next. A man in a headset opened the curtain and pointed a finger at the stage. Go on, kid. Don't keep them waiting. Alara took a deep breath. She tried to remember what her mother had told her that morning. Asterisk, just play, Alara. Play like you do at home. Don't look at them. Just look at the music. Asterisk, she nodded to herself, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the safety of the curtain. As soon as she stepped onto the stage, the lights hit her. They were blinding. She couldn't see the audience at all. It was just a huge black void in front of her, filled with hundreds of invisible eyes. She could hear the sound of people moving in their seats, the crinkle of candy wrappers, and the low hum of air conditioning. It felt like walking into the mouth of a giant beast. She walked to the center of the stage where the grand piano stood. It was a massive black monster, gleaming under the spotlights. It looked beautiful, but it also looked scary. Alara stood in front of the bench. She was supposed to sit down and adjust it, but her legs felt like jelly. She reached out to pull the bench out. It was heavier than she thought, and her hand was sweaty. Her grip slipped. The bench screeched loudly against the wooden floor. Screech. The noise was awful. It cut through the silence of the hall like a knife. Alara flinched. She quickly sat down and tried to pull the bench closer to the keys, but she moved it too fast. Her foot slipped off the pedal and hit the metal bar underneath with a loud clang. At that exact moment, silence fell over the room. But it wasn't the respectful silence of waiting. It was the silence that comes right before people start laughing. A sound rippled through the darkness. It started as a snicker from the left side of the room. Then, a man near the front let out a short, loud bark of laughter. It was a mean laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh you make when you hear a joke. It was the kind of laugh you make when you see someone trip and fall in the mud. Alara froze. Her hands hovered over the keys, but she didn't play. She felt her face get hot. It felt like someone was holding a flame to her cheeks. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floorboards and run back to the dusty backstage area. She looked up toward the judges' table. She couldn't see them well because of the lights, but she could see their shapes. One of them, a man with gray hair and a stern face, leaned back in his chair. Even from this distance, she could see him shaking his head. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He laughed again, a short huff, and turned to say something to the woman sitting next to him. The woman didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. She just looked at Alara like she was looking at a broken watch. Alara gripped the edges of the bench. Her knuckles turned white. They didn't know her. They didn't know that she had practiced every single day for 3 years. They didn't know that her father had worked 2 jobs just to pay for her lessons. They didn't know that she had played on a broken keyboard for the first 2 years, because they couldn't afford a real piano. All they saw was a little girl in a cheap dress who couldn't even sit down without making noise. The laughter in the audience grew a little louder. Someone whispered, "Is this a joke?" Another voice said, "She's too young. Look at her." Lara looked down at her trembling hands. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. If she cried now, they would never stop. If she cried, the laughter would get louder, and it would turn into booing. She knew that. She could feel it in the air. She thought about getting up and walking off. It would be easy. Just stand up, walk into the dark, and leave. But then she thought about the old beat-up piano sitting in their living room at home. It had missing felt on the hammers, so it made a clicking sound when she played. She thought about her dad sitting on the couch, listening to her practice with his eyes closed, a tired smile on his face. "This is your chance, Ellie," he had told her that morning. "Show them what you have inside." She closed her eyes tight. She blocked out the blinding lights. She blocked out the mean man in the front row. She blocked out the silence that was waiting for her to fail. She took a deep, shaky breath and let it out slowly. The air in the room was still thick with judgment and ridicule. But Alara found a tiny bubble of quiet space inside her own mind. She was just a little girl, and the world was big and scary, but the music was hers. The music didn't care about her dress. The music didn't care that she tripped. She opened her eyes. She didn't look at the judges. She didn't look at the darkness. She looked only at the black and white keys in front of her. They were waiting. They were patient. Alara lifted her hands. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, feeling the coolness of the ivory against her skin. The laughter in the room was fading into a low murmur. They were waiting for her to start so they could listen for a mistake, so they could whisper again about how she didn't belong. But Alara wasn't thinking about belonging anymore. She was thinking about the song. It was a hard piece. It was full of fast notes and sad chords. It was a piece that required strength, not just speed. She felt a sudden calm wash over her. The shaking in her hands stopped. She was ready to speak, not with words, but with sound. She was ready to turn their laughter into silence. The silence that followed Elare's struggle with the bench was not a kind silence. It was the heavy, awkward quiet that fills a room when everyone is waiting for something to go wrong. The air in the grand hall felt thick, like it was full of dust and unspoken judgment. Hundreds of people sat in the velvet darkness, their eyes fixed on the small, lonely figure hunched over the massive piano. The judge's table was the focal point of the room's tension. In the center sat Maestro Cross, the head judge. He was a man who had seen thousands of musicians over his long career. He was famous for his ear, but also for his sharp tongue. He had heard the screech of the bench and the clumsy clang of the pedal. To him, these were not just accidents. They were signs. In his world, discipline was everything. If you couldn't sit down gracefully, you probably couldn't play gracefully. Either next to him, a woman with sharp glasses and a tight expression sighed quietly. She clicked her pen, a small, impatient sound that seemed to echo in Alara's mind. She was already looking at her scoring sheet, her hand hovering near the low numbers. She had mentally checked out. She had decided before hearing a single note that this girl in the simple blue dress was not worth her time. She was just another amateur child pushed onto a stage she wasn't ready for. In the audience, the mood was similar. A man in a tuxedo leaned over to his wife and whispered, "Here comes the disaster." He didn't bother to lower his voice. He was confident that he was right. It was fun for them, in a way. It was a break from the perfection they had been watching all day. They were waiting for the train wreck, ready to cringe and then move on to the next contestant. Alara sat on the bench, her back to the crowd. She could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her shoulders like a physical weight. It felt like gravity was pulling her down, trying to keep her small. But she didn't move. She just breathed. In and out. In and out. She was no longer thinking about the fancy hall or the expensive dresses. She was reaching back into her memory, pulling herself away from this place. She thought of the tiny apartment she shared with her parents. It was always noisy there. The neighbors upstairs played loud television shows. Cars honked on the street outside. But in the corner of the living room sat their piano. It was an old upright piano, not shiny and grand like this one. The wood was scratched, and some of the keys stuck when the weather was humid. That piano was her best friend. It was the place where she went when she was sad, or when her parents were arguing about money. When she played at home, she didn't have to worry about judges or fancy clothes. She just played. She played to let the feelings out. She played to make the noise in her head stop. Maestro Cross tapped his finger on the table. He was getting bored. He looked at his watch. He wondered how long he would have to sit there before the girl realized she wasn't ready and walked away, or worse, before she started playing and proved him right with a mess of wrong notes. He prepared himself to be bored. He prepared to wince, but Alara did not walk away. She did not wince. She lifted her chin slightly. The fear was still there, hiding in her stomach like a cold stone, but she pushed it down. She decided that the judges didn't matter. The man in the tuxedo didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the story she had to tell. She lifted her hands. They looked so small against the expanse of white and black keys. The light reflected off the piano, making it look like a pool of black water. Alara took one last deep breath, held it for a second, and then let it out slowly as her fingers descended toward the keys. She was about to play a piece called "The Storm on the Ocean." It was a song that started very quietly, like a calm sea, and then grew into a roaring wave. Most students played it too fast. They played it to show off how fast their fingers could move. But Alara's teacher had told her something different. "Don't play the notes," her teacher had said. "Play the feeling. Play the fear of the sailor. Play the power of the water." Alara's fingers touched the keys. She wasn't just pushing them down. She was caressing them. The first note rang out. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't a clumsy thump. It was a clear singing sound that seemed to float into the air like a ribbon of smoke. It was a G sharp, a note that sounded like a question, quiet wondering in the dark. The reaction in the hall was instant, though silent. The man in the tuxedo who had been whispering to his wife stopped mid-word. His mouth stayed open slightly, but no sound came out. The woman with the sharp glasses froze. Her pen, which had been ready to mark a low score, hovered in the air. The look of boredom on her face cracked, replaced by a sudden stillness. Maestro Cross sat up straighter. He had expected a clumsy attack on the piano. He expected a child to hammer the keys. But this sound was different. It was incredibly soft, yet it filled the entire hall. It had a warmth to it, a depth that sounded like it came from a much older soul. Alara played the next few notes. They were slow and deliberate. Dottum, dottum. A rhythm began like a heartbeat. Her left hand played low, rolling chords that sounded like deep water moving under a ship. Her right hand played a melody that was sweet and sad. She wasn't reading the music anymore. She wasn't looking at the notes on the stand. She was playing from her heart. She closed her eyes so she could see the ocean in her mind. She wasn't in the concert hall anymore. She was on a boat, alone in the dark water. She felt the sway of the waves. She felt the cold wind on her face. And she poured that feeling into the piano. The sound was so pure that it seemed to clean the air in the room. The dust and the judgment and the laughter of a few moments ago all seemed to dissolve. The music demanded attention, but it wasn't aggressive. It was a gentle command. It whispered to the audience, "Listen to me. I have something to say." The people in the front row leaned forward. The judges stopped looking at their papers. They looked at the girl. They really looked at her for the first time. They saw the way her body moved, just a little, swaying with the music. They saw the peaceful look on her face. This wasn't a nervous child anymore. This was a musician. The piece began to change. The calm water was starting to get rough. The melody started to move faster. The notes became higher, sharper. Alara's fingers moved with a speed that was shocking, but they never lost their grace. Every note was clear, like a drop of crystal water. She was building a wall of sound, brick by brick, note by note. The tension in the hall was no longer about whether she would fail. It was about where she was taking them. The audience stopped breathing. They were on the boat with her now. They could feel the wind picking up. They could hear the thunder rolling in the distance. Maestro Cross felt a shiver go down his spine. It was a rare feeling for him. He had heard technical perfection thousands of times. He could hear a robot play a perfect scale any time. But this was human. This was raw. It was imperfect in a way that made it perfect. It had a soul, a word he rarely used because it was cliché. But there was no other word for it. The music was alive. Elara's hands blurred over the keys. She was playing parts of the song that were incredibly difficult, parts that conservatory students struggled with for years. But she made it look easy. She made it look like she wasn't even trying. Her fingers just knew where to go. She was entering the middle of the piece now. The storm was coming. The music was getting louder, filling the huge hall. The vibrations from the piano traveled through the floor and up the legs of the chairs. The audience could feel it in their bones. The earlier laughter was completely gone, erased as if it had never happened. In its place was a deep, profound awe. No one could believe that this small girl was creating this world of sound. The woman with the sharp glasses put her pen down completely. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes as if she couldn't trust what she was hearing. She looked at Maestro Cross. He was staring at Alara, his face impossible to read, but his eyes were wide. He wasn't bored anymore. He was hypnotized. Lorraine didn't notice any of this. She was in her own world, a world made of sound and emotion. And the most powerful part of the storm was still to come. The music did not just stay in the air. It seemed to grab a hold of everyone in the room and demand their full attention. The first gentle notes had been a surprise, a quiet whisper that shut everyone up. But now, Alara was changing the rhythm. She was moving into the part of the song that was fast, complicated, and scary. It was the part where the ocean stops being calm and starts to get angry. Her hands began to move faster. Before, they had been gliding over the keys like a soft breeze. Now, they were striking the keys with precision and power. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of the piano mechanism, the hammers hitting the strings, became a blur of noise. But the melody that came out was crystal clear. It was a cascade of water, tumbling down from a great height. Most children who played this piece tried to play it as fast as they could. They thought speed was the most important thing. They would bang on the keys, trying to make as much noise as possible. But Alara was different. She played the fast notes with a strange kind of carefulness. Even though her hands were moving so fast they looked like a blur, every single note was distinct. It wasn't just noise. It was 1,000 tiny voices singing at the same time. Maestro Cross leaned forward over his table. He had heard this song played by the best students in the country. He knew exactly what it should sound like. Usually, by this point in the music, the player would start to look tense. Their shoulders would go up. Their jaw would tighten. They would look like they were fighting a war against the piano. But Alara looked peaceful. Her face was calm, almost like she was sleeping. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the side. She wasn't fighting the piano. She was dancing with it. Her hands moved up and down the keyboard, jumping large distances without missing a single note. It was like magic. How could a girl with such small hands reach so far? How could she move so fast without making a mistake? In the front row, a young man who had been laughing earlier stopped checking his phone. He had come to the concert to support a friend, but when his friend finished, this girl had started playing. He had laughed at her entrance, thinking she looked ridiculous. Now he felt a burning shame in his chest. He watched her fingers fly across the ivory keys, and he realized he was witnessing something he might never see again. He put his phone in his pocket and didn't take it out again. The music swelled. Alara pressed the pedal down with her foot, and the sound became a deep, roaring river. The vibrations of the piano shook the stage floor, but Alara didn't seem to notice. She was leaning into the instrument now. The music was getting louder and more intense. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a story, because the audience couldn't see Alara's face clearly. They started to see their own stories in the music. A woman in the back row, a grandmother who had spent her life working hard, felt tears prick her eyes. The fast, tumbling notes reminded her of the years passing by, of time moving so fast that you couldn't catch it. A businessman who usually only cared about money and success felt a tightness in his chest. The music sounded like ambition, like the desperate, scrambling climb to the top. Lara played a series of chords that were heavy and dark. Boom, boom, boom. The sound filled the hall like thunder. She wasn't just pressing the keys. She was leaning her whole body weight into them. She was small, but the sound she made was huge. It was the sound of a storm crashing against a rocky shore. Then suddenly, the storm changed. The fast tumbling notes stopped. Alara's hands moved to the high end of the piano. The notes became light and airy, like the wind blowing through the grass after the rain. Her left hand was playing low, rumbling notes that sounded like distant thunder, while her right hand played a melody that was hopeful and bright. It was this contrast that caught the judges off guard. Maestro cross-tapped his fingers lightly on the table. He was amazed by her control. To go from a loud, crashing roar to a soft, gentle whisper in a split second was incredibly difficult. It took a mastery of the instrument that usually took decades to learn. Yet here was a 10-year-old girl doing it naturally. She wasn't thinking about the technique. She was just feeling it. She played a line of notes that went higher and higher, climbing up a ladder of sound. The audience held their breath. Where was she going? How high could she go? The tension was unbearable. Everyone was leaning forward in their seats. The woman with the sharp glasses, the one who had been ready to fail, Alara, now had her hand over her mouth. She was a piano teacher herself. She knew the physical difficulty of what Alara was doing. She knew that to keep the tone even while playing so quietly was one of the hardest things to do. She looked at Alara's posture. It was perfect. Her arms were loose, her wrists were flexible. It was the natural form of a genius. The teacher felt a lump in her throat. She realized she had been judging a book by its cover. And now that the book was open, the story was breathtaking. Alara's hands reached the very top of the keyboard. She played the highest note of the song, a piercing, crystal-clear sound that hung in the air like a star. Then, her left hand played one final, deep chord. For a moment, everything stopped. The high note faded away into silence, but the deep chord seemed to last forever. It resonated through the wooden floor of the stage, through the walls of the hall, and into the bones of everyone listening. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Before, the silence had been bored and mocking. People were waiting for her to mess up. Now, the silence was full of awe. It was a heavy, holy silence. No one moved. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. Hundreds of people were frozen, staring at the stage, unable to look away. Alara sat with her hands hovering over the keys for a second longer. She was still in her trance. She could still hear the ocean in her head. She could still feel the spray of the salt water on her face. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly. Then, she lowered her hands to her lap. The moment her hands left the keys, the spell was broken. But the explosion that Alara expected didn't happen right away. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing but quiet. Then, from the back of the hall, a man shouted, "Yes." It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a genuine shout of excitement that broke the dam. The entire hall erupted. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound that crashed over the stage, louder than the storm Alara had just played on the piano. People stood up all at once. They didn't just stand. They jumped to their feet. The young man in the front row was clapping so hard his palms were stinging, and he was shouting, "Bravo!" over and over again on stage. The lights were still blinding Alara. She couldn't see their faces, but she could feel the energy. It hit her like a physical force. The sound of hundreds of people cheering, screaming, and stomping their feet was overwhelming. It wasn't the polite applause the other contestants had received. This was raw, unfiltered love. Alara blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. She looked out at the darkness, confused for a second. She looked down at her dress, remembering how plain she looked. She thought about how she had tripped coming in. She couldn't understand why they were acting like this. To her, she had just played the song. She had just told the truth. But as the cheers washed over her, she felt a warmth start in her chest. It was a feeling she had never felt before. It wasn't just happiness. It was relief. It was the feeling of being seen. She had been invisible her whole life. The poor girl in the back of the class. The girl with the old piano. But for 3 minutes, she had made the whole world stop and listen to her. She slowly stood up. Her legs felt shaky again, but this time it wasn't from fear. She turned toward the judges. The noise was so loud she couldn't hear her own thoughts. Maestro Cross was standing. The head judge, the man who never stood up for anyone, was on his feet. He wasn't clapping his hands above his head like the audience, but he was bringing his hands together slowly, deliberately, with deep respect. He looked Alara right in the eyes and gave her a single, solemn nod. It was a small gesture, but to Alara, it meant more than all the screaming in the world. The laughter that had haunted her at the beginning of her performance was gone. It had been completely erased by the sound of her genius. Alara gave a small, shy curtsy, stumbling just a little bit on her dress. The crowd laughed, but this time it was a kind laugh. They laughed because they loved her. They laughed because she was human, and she was amazing. She walked off the stage, her heart pounding harder than ever before, but her soul was lighter than air. She knew, without a doubt, that her life would never be the same again. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a physical wave that crashed against the walls of the concert hall. It was the kind of noise that usually only happened at a sports game when the home team scored the winning goal in the final second. But this wasn't a stadium. It was a hall, usually reserved for quiet sophistication. And the person causing the commotion was a 10-year-old girl in a blue dress who was currently walking. Backstage, as if she were sleepwalking, Alara stepped through the heavy velvet curtains. And the noise from the audience instantly became muffled, like she had stepped under water. Backstage, the air was cool and smelled of dust. The other contestants, the ones in the tuxedos and shiny dresses, were standing there. Earlier, they had looked at her with pity or indifference. Now, they were staring at her with wide eyes and open mouths. The boy with the expensive violin was holding his instrument case, but he wasn't moving. He looked at Alara like she was a ghost. He had played perfectly. Every note was in the right place. Every rhythm was exact. But he hadn't made the audience feel anything. He had played the notes. Alara had played the soul. He realized in that moment that perfection and beauty were two different things. He looked down at his feet, feeling a strange mix of envy and awe. He knew that no matter how well he played next, the memory of the girl in the simple dress would be the only thing people talked about tonight, back in the hall. The audience was slowly sitting down, but the energy in the room had completely changed. It felt like the air had been charged with electricity. The man who had whispered about a disaster earlier was now wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. He felt a profound sense of shame. He had judged a child by her clothes and her clumsiness. He had laughed at her. And now, that same child had reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart until he cried. He turned to his wife, unable to speak, just shaking his head in disbelief. But the most significant change was happening at the judges. Table Maestro Cross sat back down in his chair. He was a man who was known for being difficult to impress. Over his 40-year career, he had heard thousands of pianists. He had heard technical wizards who could play faster than the eye could see. He had heard young prodigies who played like robots, perfect but empty. But Alara, she was different. He looked down at the scoring sheet in front of him. Next to the box for technique, he hesitated. Her technique hadn't been perfect. There had been a few moments where her phrasing was unorthodox. Moments where she took liberties with the tempo that a strict teacher would mark as wrong. But the box next to it said musicality and emotion. Maestro Cross picked up his pen. He didn't just tick a box. He circled the number 10. Twice. Then, with a shaking hand, he drew a line through the lower scores he had mentally prepared. He realized that the rules he had lived by, the strict structures of classical music, meant nothing if there was no heart behind them. This girl had broken the rules, but she had done it to tell the truth. And that, to him, was the highest form of art. He looked over at the woman with the sharp glasses. She was a professor at a famous music conservatory. She spent her days teaching students how to curve their fingers and how to hold their wrists. She taught them the science of the piano. But as she sat there, listening to the fading echo of Ilara's performance, she felt like she had been teaching it all wrong. She thought about her students. They played with perfect posture. They played with their chins up, looking at the audience, begging for applause. Ilara had played with her eyes closed, ignoring the audience, ignoring the judges. She had played only for the music. The professor realized she had been teaching her students to be performers, to be actors. But Ilara was a musician. The professor took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She felt a tear slide down her cheek. She felt a strange mix of sadness and joy-sadness that she had never played with such freedom. But joy that she had been lucky enough to witness it. The third judge, a younger man who usually just followed Maestro Cross's lead, looked terrified. He looked at Cross, terrified that he would have to judge the next person. How could anyone follow that? It felt unfair to the other contestants. It felt like asking someone to read a grocery list after Shakespeare had just finished a play. He knew that the competition was effectively over. The winner had just walked off the stage. Backstage, Ilara sat on a wooden crate near the exit. Her heart was still racing. She felt dizzy. She wasn't used to so much emotion. She wasn't used to people looking at her like she was special. Her hands were resting on her lap, tingling slightly from the exertion of playing so hard. A stage hand. A big man with a beard who usually just moved equipment and ignored the kids walked by. He stopped. He looked at Ilara, really looked at her. He saw that she was trembling. He didn't say anything about the music. He didn't say good job, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. It was a simple, cheap chocolate, nothing fancy. He held it out to her. "You look like you need this, kid," he said gruffly. Ilara looked up at him. Her eyes were wide and wet. She took the chocolate. "Thank you," she whispered. The man smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile. "I've been working here for 20 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of people play that piano, but I've never heard anything like that. You made it sound like it was talking." Ilara unwrapped the chocolate slowly. It was such a small thing, but it grounded her. It made her feel human again. She took a bite. The sweetness spread through her mouth. For a second, she wasn't a genius or a prodigy. She was just a girl eating chocolate. Out in the hall, the announcer walked onto the stage. He looked nervous. The audience was still buzzing, still whispering to each other. He tapped the microphone. Thump, thump. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Please settle down. We have more contestants." The audience groaned slightly. They didn't want more contestants. They wanted Ilara to come back out. They wanted to hear more of that magic. A few people actually shouted, "Bring her back!" But the announcer shook his head. The next contestant walked out. It was a tall, confident boy who had practiced his piece for years. He sat down at the piano, ready to play. But as he struck the first chord, it felt wrong. It sounded flat. It sounded boring. After Ilara's storm, after her raw emotion, this boy's perfect playing sounded like a machine. The audience sighed. They shifted in their seats. They had seen the sun. They didn't want to look at a light bulb. The judges felt it too. Maestro Cross sighed and picked up his pen again. He tried to focus. He really did. He tried to give the boy a fair chance. But his mind kept drifting back to the image of the small girl in the blue dress, playing with her eyes closed, pouring her heart out onto the keys. He realized that he had been waiting his whole life for that moment. He had spent decades judging people on how well they followed the rules. But Ilara had shown him that true genius doesn't follow rules. Ilara finished her chocolate and stood up. She could hear the next person playing. It was a difficult piece, and they were playing it well. But she knew it wasn't the same. She walked towards the side exit, peeking through a small crack in the curtain. She saw the back of the audience's heads. She saw Maestro Cross sitting at the table. He looked deep in thought. She didn't know that she had changed him. She didn't know that the arrogant man in the front row was going home to hug his children. She didn't know that the music teacher was going to change. It's the way she taught tomorrow. All Lara knew was that she had played the truth. She had let the storm out, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't just a Lara from the small apartment. She was a Lara, the musician, and that was enough. She took a deep breath, the smell of the chocolate still on her fingers, and waited for the night to end. The final notes of the very last contestant faded into the air, but no one really cared. The poor boy had played perfectly, hitting every single note with the precision of a computer. But the hall was filled with a restless energy. It was like trying to serve a plain cracker to people who just tasted a feast. The audience politely applauded, but their hearts weren't in it. Everyone was waiting. They were waiting for the judges to do what they all knew needed to be done. On the stage, the announcer looked nervous. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat into the microphone. The feedback screeched for a second, making everyone wince. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing in the huge room, "we have reached the end of a very long day. Our judges have tallied the scores. It is now my honor to announce the winners of this year's competition." The room went silent again, but it was a tense silence. People were on the edge of their seats. The man in the tuxedo stopped looking at his watch. The young man who had laughed earlier was leaning forward, his hands clasped together tight. Ilara was standing in the wings, the side area of the stage hidden by curtains. Her father was there now. He had rushed from his job as soon as he could, still wearing his dusty work boots and a shirt that was wrinkled from a long day. He put his big, rough hands on Ilara's shoulders. He didn't say anything about the music. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just squeezed her shoulders and smiled. That smile was better than any trophy. It was a look of pure, fatherly pride. It told her that no matter what happened next, she was already a winner in his eyes. And in third place, the announcer's voice boomed, playing the sonata in C major. Theodore Vane. Polite applause went up. Theodore walked onto the stage, looking very serious. He bowed and accepted his small medal. He looked happy, but even he seemed to know that this wasn't the main event. He looked over at the judges, then back at the curtain where Ilara was hiding. He knew he had been beaten. And in second place, the announcer continued with a stunning performance of the Winter Concerto. Miss Victoria Halloway. More applause. Victoria, the girl with the sparkly dress and the diamond hairpins, walked out. She smiled her practiced pageant smile. She waved to the crowd, but when she looked at the judges, she saw that Maestro Cross wasn't clapping. He was just staring at the envelope in his hand. Victoria's smile faltered just a little bit. She felt it too. The air in the room had shifted. The magic that Ilara had made had ruined the night for everyone else. The announcer took a deep breath. He looked at the card, then looked up at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "the winner of the Golden Key competition and the recipient of the Grand Scholarship is a very special young lady. Please put your hands together for Ilara Vance." For a split second, there was silence. It was the shock of it. Ilara? The girl in the cheap dress? The girl who tripped. But then, the silence shattered. It wasn't just applause. It was an explosion of joy. The entire audience stood up as one. The noise was like a jet engine taking off. People were stomping their feet. They were whistling. They were shouting her name. Ilara, Ilara. Ilara froze behind the curtain. Her father gave her a gentle push. "Go on, Ellie," he whispered. "They're waiting for you." She walked out into the blinding lights. It was different this time. She didn't feel like a bug under a microscope. She felt like she was floating. The lights didn't hurt her eyes. They felt warm. She walked to the center of the stage. The announcer handed her a large bouquet of flowers and a heavy gold trophy. It was so heavy she almost dropped it, but she held it tight. She looked out at the sea of people. They were all standing. They were all clapping. The man who had laughed was wiping his eyes again. The woman with the sharp glasses was clapping so hard her hands were red. But Ilara looked past them. She looked at the judge's table. Maestro Cross stood up. He slowly walked out from behind the table and onto the stage. The audience quieted down a little, wondering what he was doing. He walked over to Elora. He was a tall, imposing man, but he looked at her with the softest eyes she had ever seen. He didn't shake her hand. Instead, he reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Then he turned to the audience and signaled for silence. "Music, Maestro," Cross said, his voice strong and clear, without even needing a microphone. "Music is not about the notes. It is not about how fast your fingers move. It is not about how expensive your dress is." He paused and looked down at Elora. "This young lady," he continued, "taught us something today. She reminded us why we play. She reminded us that music is the language of the heart. We judges, we listen for technique all day. We look for perfection. But today, perfection was boring. Today, truth was beautiful. Thank you, Elora, for waking us up." The crowd roared again. Elora felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She didn't care. She looked at the maestro and curtsied deeply. It was a clumsy curtsy, her dress twisting around her legs. But it was the most honest curtsy the world had ever seen. She walked off the stage, following her father. They didn't go to the fancy reception party. They didn't stay for the pictures. They walked out the back door of the concert hall into the cool night air. The city was buzzing with cars and lights, but it felt peaceful. Elora's father stopped and kneeled down on one knee, right there on the sidewalk. He pulled her into a giant hug. "I am so proud of you," he whispered into her hair. "So proud." "I did it, Dad," Elora whispered back, clutching her trophy and her flowers. "I really did it." "No, Ellie," he said, pulling back and looking her in the eye. "You didn't just win. You changed them. You saw how they looked at you. They weren't looking at a poor girl anymore. They were looking at a queen." They walked home together, past the fancy shops and the expensive hotels. Elora's feet were tired, and her arms were sore from holding the flowers, but she felt lighter than air. She knew that tomorrow she would have to go back to school. She knew she would still have to wear her old clothes. She knew her life wouldn't magically become perfect just because she won a trophy, but something inside her had changed forever. She knew now that she didn't need to shine like a diamond to be valuable. She didn't need to be like the other girls. Her voice was her own, and it was strong enough to move a room full of strangers. She looked up at the stars, twinkling in the city sky, and smiled. The laughter that had scared her at the beginning of the night was gone. In its place was the music, and that was something no one could ever take away from her.